Was Jewish monotheism exclusive or inclusive in its account of God's divinity? We have already looked at whether monotheism is an appropriate description for ancient Israelite religion and Second Temple Jewish devotion to one deity. But now we have to ask if Jewish monotheism was guarded in its account of God's uniqueness, or was it inclusive with other beings, heavenly or human, able to share in divine functions and divine worship? Israel's sacred literature often describes God's direct intervention in human affairs. In other places, God acts through special agents such as his wisdom, word, spirit, the angels of the Lord, or named angels like Michael and Metatron, Daniel's one like a son of man, Israel's king, the high priest, and patriarchs like Enoch and Moses. Sometimes these agents exercise divine functions, and on some occasions they even receive types of reverence. Were these many figures a personification of God? Were they angelic creatures deputized into divinity? Or were they subordinated beings existing in an inferior mode of divinity? James McGrath points out, numerous Jewish texts allow for the existence of a second figure alongside God, of high rank and at times almost blending into God, yet at other times clearly subordinate and distinct. None of these figures are necessarily on par with Israel's God. Even so, they indicate that the line separating the human from the divine in ancient Judaism was not absolute, as is sometimes supposed. That brings us to the primary issue under investigation. Was Jesus considered divine in the same way that these intermediary figures were divine? That's very much the heart of the question about Jewish monotheism and its relation to early Christology. Hi, I'm Mike Bird, and welcome to the Nazareth to Nicaea podcast and vodcast, the program where we look at all things about the historical Jesus, the Christ of faith, and early Christology. Okay, the question before us is whether Jewish monotheism was strict. Was God's divinity exclusive and guarded? Or does God kind of share his divineness, his godness, with other beings, heavenly or human? We could have a survey of all kinds of figures such as Enoch from 1 Enoch, Melchizedek from Qumran, the angels of the Lord from the Hebrew Bible. But I want to focus on Moses. Yes, that's Moses from the Old Testament, because Moses gets afforded incredibly unbelievable and intense divine status and divine qualities. The reason I've picked Moses is because Moses can be portrayed with amazing and elevated quasi-divine descriptions in both biblical and post-biblical literature. So we're going to look at Moses to test how strict ancient Jewish monotheism was. First, in the book of Exodus, Yahweh tells Moses to keep confronting Pharaoh. That's despite Moses' own feelings of inadequacy, and that's despite Pharaoh's own recalcitrance. But Moses is encouraged with the promise that he will have godlike power over Pharaoh, and Aaron, his brother, will be his prophet. Listen to the words of Exodus 7:1. And the Lord said to Moses, "See, I've made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet." Given that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, have some very strict remarks about Jewish monotheism, about only worshipping God, avoiding idols and the worship of the nations and any other sort of lesser being, given those prohibitions, it's quite startling that Moses is called a god in relation to Pharaoh. The word God is used. Elohim in Hebrew, or if you look at the Septuagint, it's theos. It's unusual, precisely because it attributes at least a comparative kind of divinity to Moses, complete with his own prophetic servant in his brother Aaron. Now, commentators do struggle with this. They are kind of startled like this, and they come up with some explanations. So someone like Brevard Childs says, look, what's going on here is that Moses is simply to function with divine authority before Pharaoh. And much like God, he makes known his word through his own prophet, who's one of his servants. Thomas Romer sees here a sense of parody. Moses is called God, but that's a parody of Pharaoh, who's meant to be kind of like a god king of Egypt. And in the same sense that Aaron is a parody. He stands as the counterpart of the Egyptian magicians. So, in any case, Moses is not a full-on God. He's still a human being like Pharaoh, and he's still below Yahweh. The problem with trying to explain away Exodus 7:1 is that in the same book, in the book of Exodus, you can find some other strong references to Moses with sort of divine prerogatives, or being an instrument of God. In fact, in chapter 8, verse 19, Moses is called the finger of God. Moses is portrayed as having divine power and even exercising divine agency. So Exodus 7:1, it can't be written off as the exception. We have a depiction of Moses with godlike power and godlike authority over Pharaoh. Even if he's not on the same level as Yahweh, he's still being portrayed as a quasi-divine or superhuman being. He is, in some sense, a god. Furthermore, if we look at the reception of Exodus 7:1, this indicates many authors wrestling with Moses and monotheism, where they have an elevated view of Moses, but also a very intense sense of the guardedness and the exclusivity of Yahweh's own status and identity. But despite that guardedness, they still describe Moses in incredibly elevated ways and offer him or imagine him receiving certain types of reverence. For example, Ben Sirach, a Jewish sage, he celebrates Moses' memory by saying that God made Moses equal in glory to the holy ones and made him great to the terror of his enemies. And God glorified him in the presence of kings. If you look at the Qumran scrolls, Moses is called a god over the mighty. Josephus narrates that Moses was, on account of his great virtue, assumed up to heaven in a cloud. I mean, his own apotheosis, his own kind of deification, if you like. Also, Josephus tells us that the Essenes venerated Moses as second only to God, and they considered anything spoken against Moses to be tantamount to blasphemy. I mean, those are very strong claims indeed. But that's not the end of it. Philo also alludes to Exodus 7:1 to imagine Moses as a god in the sense of someone who rules over his own body and mind as part of the cultivation of virtue, ebbing closer and closer towards divinity. In fact, Moses' virtue reaches such luminous heights that he was granted a participation in God's own nature, which is, says Philo, pure tranquility. Elsewhere, Philo says that Moses was designated as God and King of the whole nation because of his unique communion with God and because he was granted dominion by God over the created order. Another important text, also coming from Egypt, about Moses is Ezekiel the Tragedian. This is a Hellenistic drama, basically retelling the Exodus narrative. But in the drama, there's a point where Moses has a dream where he reports he's going to end up sitting on God's own throne. In fact, God will vacate the throne to make room for Moses. So listen to this. Listen to this dream sequence. On Sinai's peak, I saw what seemed a throne. So great in size, it touched the clouds of heaven. Upon it sat a man of noble mien, becrowned and with a scepter in one hand, while with the other he did beckon me. I made approach and stood before the throne. He handed o'er the scepter, and he bade me mount the throne, and gave to me the crown. Then he himself withdrew off the throne. I gazed upon the whole earth round about, things under it, high and above the skies. Then at my feet a multitude of stars fell down, and I their number reckoned up. They passed by me like armed ranks of men. Then I, in terror, wakened from the dream. Dream sequence, in this Hellenistic drama, envisages Moses' greatness in a way that is extraordinary and kind of unprecedented. I mean, he's not simply invited to have a throne before God or sit on God's throne, but God vacates his own throne and basically gives it to Moses, and then various stars come out and parade before him, as if Moses is their king or their emperor, and like an army parading before their warlord or something like that. The description of Moses on the throne and the seeming abdication of God implies, for some commentators, that this is about Moses' deification, or in the very least his appointment as God's vice regent, or else he becomes an earthly counterpart to the divine God in heaven. Now, if we take all of this together, the depiction of Moses as a god over Pharaoh in Exodus 7:1, with Philo describing Moses as God and king of the Israelites, of him sitting on God's own throne in Ezekiel the Tragedian, then we really are confronted with the question whether ancient Jewish monotheism was strict and exclusive, because it would seem in the case of Moses that divine prerogatives, divine power, divine sovereignty, in some senses, are even being shared with Moses. I mean, if Moses can be called a god, exercise sovereignty over the earth, and occupy the divine throne with celestial honors, does this not demonstrate that ancient monotheism was malleable and flexible enough to include a human subject within the honors and functions often attributed to the God of Israel? Which would mean, much like the Greco-Roman world, that ancient Judaism had its own pyramid of divinity, one in which human beings could gradually climb up, if you like. Now, if that is the case, it would be very easy to imagine that Jesus is divine, maybe kind of like Moses was. In Exodus 7:1, he has godlike authority over some beings, and the church is his prophet, like Aaron was a prophet to Moses. Or maybe he's God and king, or a divine Messiah in the same sense that Philo attributes that to Moses. Or maybe the language of Jesus being on the throne with God or co-enthroned is no different to Ezekiel the Tragedian, where Moses is given the divine throne. Maybe Jesus' divinity then is entirely unremarkable and full of precedence in the way that Moses is heralded as a divine being. But is it really the case that Moses is depicted as a divine being in a way that trespasses or infringes on the unique divine identity of the God of Israel? Are these various traditions we've seen in Exodus, Philo, and elsewhere, are they really indications that divinity, even absolute divinity, was flexible and blurry, that monotheism, or the highest form of divinity there was kind of a flexible concept which other humans or other angels could somehow be promoted within? Well, I'm not too sure we should rush to that conclusion for a number of things. Okay, first of all, let's go back and look at Exodus 7:1. I think Moses is cast as a type of divine being, but not in the same sense as Yahweh. He is God or godlike to Pharaoh, but in a relative and honorific sense. In Exodus 7:1, Moses is like a god over Pharaoh because Pharaoh has power over Moses. And in fact, so great is Moses' power over Pharaoh and his kingdom that the only analogy for it, the only fitting explanation, is to describe Moses as having divine-like power and authority over Pharaoh. So in terms of their relative relationship, yeah, Moses has godlike or divine power. But is Moses therefore godlike and divine compared to Yahweh? Well, not necessarily. Let's go back to Philo. with his description of Moses as God and king over the nation. And even with Philo's elastic definition of the theoi or divinity, which includes various angels and subordinate powers, yet Philo, he still has a very strict sense of God's exclusive and guarded divinity that is not shared with others. Philo is very clear that God is a transcendent being with an incomparable nature and unrivaled authority. And in fact, Philo makes this very clear. In other places, he says that Moses is not God in either, note this, in either truth or being. In Greek, that's alethean kaito aino. Neither in truth or being is Moses divine in the same sense of God. But, Philo says, he is a man of God who is godlike over the foolish man. Note the big difference there. He's not divine as God is divine, but he's divine like the virtuous and wise man is over a foolish man. Philo is a careful, very careful, scrupulously careful, in fact, to avoid any suggestion that Moses is on par with Israel's God, even if he thinks that Moses is elevated far above any mere mortal because of the great ascent and the great accumulation of virtue that Moses has demonstrated. So even Philo, with his employment of Exodus 7:1, it's still governed by the conviction that it is impious and improper for a human being to be acclaimed as God on par with Israel's God. Let's go back to Ezekiel the Tragedian, that amazing dream sequence where God vacates his throne and basically gives it to Moses. You've got to remember that this is a dramatic fiction about a dream. Okay, it's fiction about a dream. In fact, if you look at the interpretation of Moses' dream, which is given by Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, it leads to a fairly benign claim in the end. I mean, this is how Jethro interprets Moses' dream. And now this is said in the text. You shall cause a mighty throne to rise, and you yourself shall rule and govern men. As for beholding all the peopled earth, and things below and things above God's realm, things present, past, and future, you shall see. In other words, in Jethro's interpretation of Moses' dream, all it means is that Moses is going to rule and govern Israel, and he'll be permitted to see things that are going to happen in the future, which is a pretty reduced, a pretty benign, a pretty muted claim, given the dramatic imagery and language of Moses basically replacing Yahweh on the throne in heaven. The rest of the narrative also makes it very clear that Moses is God's own servant, and he remains a very, very human figure. So traditions of Moses as a divine-like being, which begin in Exodus 7:1 and then develop their own reception history and development, particularly in the Hellenistic period, they never really bust the ceiling that separates God from his creatures. And I don't think they really infringe upon the unique divine identity, the exclusive godness of God as it was understood in antiquity. Well, that wraps up our second episode on Jewish monotheism. But to finish it off, in the next episode, I'll be doing an interview with Professor Matthew Lynch of Regent College. We're going to talk more about monotheism there. Professor Lynch knows a lot about Jewish monotheism. He's been part of these rather torrid and intense debates about the nature of monotheism, both in the Hebrew Bible and in subsequent Jewish literature as well. That'll be a great discussion. Make sure you don't miss out. And the way to make sure you don't miss out is by hitting that subscribe button. Otherwise, if you like what you heard, share, like, leave a comment, a review. It all helps. Otherwise, hope you enjoyed the show and see you next time.